Yeah, so this is the first piece of work that the amplifier group is responsible for is something that we've called a radar, a fire radar, which is a very fast look through, intending to look through the fog, not intending to be absolutely proved in every step of what's coming that fire can be a part of, what forces we see already that we think will strengthen and give direction to the best projects that will come out of the process of 10 calls over the next 7 years, of reviewers asking what's the best science, what's the best technology, and how do we move ahead as fast as possible. So we're looking at not only where are the projects that are presently the mainstay of fire, where are they going in the most interesting directions, but also where are they going to be pulled. And we think that's the most important change to think about. Fire started with a set of very clear technical directions and the issues of how to do these well, the integration of content, voice, data across networks throughout the world. And there were a lot of interesting problems to do that well, and fire evolved towards the user during that period. But I think if we look at the next 7 years, or I'll call it the decade, we need to look at the endpoints and move towards a future. And so we've got a list of the Internet of Things, the Internet of Services, the Internet of Information and content. And finally, the Internet of people, defining a network by their actions, their interests, and, if you like, people building a dynamic conversation facilitated by the Internet that is around them. And so the technology begins to be important only in that it lets us do things. The technology becomes less visible, I'd say, in the results that fire will be proud of at the end of the decade. So how do we get there? Well, what we've tried to create in our radar document is something that is forward-looking, that represents the community, which is why it needs discussion and it needs exposure, and people need to tear us apart for saying things that are silly so that we can do a better job on it. Tells where we want to go, what we hope to accomplish, and how we think we'll select from the myriad opportunities that we have in front of us right now. If you look at the structure of fire today, and this takes us to about the 7th and 8th calls. There's a series of IPs which provide facilities usable to different subsets of the people building new technologies for the Internet of the future. Coordinated by a federation action, the Fed for Fire integrated project, and accompanied by, in a very loose sense, a series of STREPs, which have been augmented by STREPs which in a subsequent call were required to have something like a letter of support from one of the integrated projects. The conditions spelled out in the later parts of the 7th framework have oscillated between making an explicit requirement for a connection to a fire IP to a looser or a less clearly stated requirement, which many of the STREPs have nonetheless observed. So STREP proposals appear to read multiple calls in order to find out what they could most usefully do. In the same way, the conditions on coordination between the integrated projects have varied from call to call, such as requiring budget set aside for open calls, which was a clear requirement at one point, a less clear requirement, but all the integrated projects appear to be doing it for their own benefit. So we've now reached a point where There are STREPs relatively well connected with the facility integrated projects, and STREPs continue to come along that do internet science that may or may not relate to the core fire activities. And we're at the point where Horizon 2020 is kicking off within the time frame that the present activities will be finishing. So how do we build a radar? We've tried to work in two directions. One of them is looking at the changing nature of user demand, experimenter demand on fire facilities. And the clearest, because it's the most rapidly changing piece of evidence for the changing nature of demand, is what are the accepted proposals. Actually, what are the proposals asking of the fire facilities? You saw from Geraldine's table, there's been an enormous number of open calls. The number, to some extent, varies with how user visible a facility is, with Santander, Bonfire, and Experimedia being highly user visible, and Crew, cognitive radio, having probably the highest requirements for, you have to know a lot. You have to be doing some very special things to be able to take advantage of Crew's facilities, and they're getting a lot of proposals still. They can only afford to support explicitly through EC funding a small number, and so we've looked at those. And the trend that I think comes out of that is the open calls were at first viewed as a way to validate the usefulness of a fire facility. That is, can new people come up and use it, not just the ones who built it? It's the question you ask about any piece of software. A program has to be something that's useful by people other than the guy who wrote it. And this is extending that concept to the test beds. And so in the first call, most of the integrated projects selected partners that extended their reach. For example, Ophelia doubled the number of islands that they were able to provide in their first call, and then did new things in the second call. And that seems like a natural extension. So the second call took more risks, accepted partners who stretched the projects in interesting ways. And one of the clear trends that came out in several of the second call selections is software-defined networking, not just directly on OpenFlow, but on other test beds that had begun to pick up OpenFlow capabilities from Ophelia and extend them, for example, to Planet Lab Europe. Bonfire, a distributed cloud, is now supporting experiments that do novel things with the distribution of big data, which I think is a trend we're going to see continuing. And both Santander and Experimedia are supporting modest-sized experiments in which a wireless network is, I think you could call it socially aware, is directly responding to user needs. Open access does two things. Open access is, well, the money for open calls has run out. The facility is still here. We think it's valuable. Other people would like to use it. Come on in. In that case, there's still a cost to the facility because new users require support. They require training. They call you up, and you really can't keep them at arm's length. You have to help them. And if you do help them, their results become a means of continuing to bring attraction and validation to the facility. STREPs as a missed opportunity. Well, you can argue that both ways. STREPs have to do things that may not directly exercise the facilities, but the coordination between STREPs and the core fire facilities has always been a difficult challenge. My feeling is that we've gotten the best coordination when it's become a part of the requirements for proposals. that at least the struts demonstrate awareness of this. We'll talk later on about coordination with the different kinds of peer projects, international projects, industrially focused projects. We've moved on in the radar to talking about scenarios which stretch beyond the things that we will probably do, but which we want to understand. They help us to learn how to think about the ways in which fire can evolve. The types of scenarios, well, if you just sit and try to think of all the good things that could be done in the next years, you come up with a list like integrating networking through software-defined, through enhanced networking software, more tightly with the applications and more tightly with the nature of the content, the location of the content, the hooks needed to use the content. And there are a host of ideas in that space. If you are interested in all the things that are happening at the edge of the network, in particular, the technologies that are bringing very high bandwidth to the smartphone, to the tablet, to users walking around in augmented spaces of one sort or another. I think the key thing that will enhance usability of that high bandwidth is social control, controlled by one user and by the needs of groups of users that can be identified and aggregated. Think of it as the crowdsourced network that takes advantage of the high bandwidth available in wireless. We'll see scenarios, we've drafted some scenarios that exploit smart cities doing the things that are just becoming possible in Smart Santander, and ask how do we make that usable and make it real enough so that it can play a role in innovation. And finally, there's a need, and this requires an interesting kind of coordination. Doing science not just on enormous flows of data such as the LHC in CERN, but the data that comes from all kinds of digital observations, weather, atmospheric science, the observation of traffic, of business, all of it is distributed and needs to be summarized and collected in order to effectively interact and predict with that kind of stuff. It's within the purview of the infrastructures and facilities that fire is building, the research that fire is doing, but it lives in a different part of the EC's funding view, and that is there's been, this is a personal opinion, it isn't really an amplifier view, but I live also part of the time in the science world, and I see the science world moving to the ERC and the ICT community not really being tightly aware of the problems of doing science in the future, in the next decade. And I would like to see ways of creating combined science and engineering infrastructure projects that allow both to be more effective, that allow better science to be done, and also that allow the infrastructure that we provide to be more appropriate to scientific goals, and as a result, satisfying other more obviously commercializable objectives. Jacques.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was just thinking that our, each of one of the topics that was mentioned, we try and attract more users. Is this, I mean, looking at the science for the community, could this be an idea to explore?
Oh, yes, scientists definitely want to be users, and they're every bit as uninterested in the wonderful details of the facility that we provide as an SME or a startup. They have very clear objectives, and they want to get there with in the fastest way possible without getting too hung up in the details of the tools.
And then I have maybe a question for trend, I would say, to go more towards innovation, which means probably more to SMEs and industry rather than science. Also, there is still a challenge on science, but can we combine both in future projects? It's something that we cannot make. There is first of all nothing against combining them, so there is no condition. So if the conditions are right and the interests are such that they can bring together science and an SME and whoever else, I think there is nothing against.
Well, you have to remember, though, that the process of selecting projects shapes the outcomes. And so the problem anytime you bring together people from relatively different worlds, like biology and networking, or science and networking more generally, is finding a way to judge appropriately such a proposal. It's always the reviewers. So we've also come up with some structured approaches to thinking about sustainability, and I'll show you a couple charts at the end of this talk. If you ask how are the existing facilities looking to become more sustainable, there are really two models, and people gravitate fairly naturally into either an academic focus, that is research that gets published and shared among people who have a common technical ground, or industrially focused, a service looking more directly at measuring the contributions to innovation that a facility makes. And I see in several places groups that go beyond a single academic institution or a single nonprofit laboratory, creating a brand under which an organization can form that would support the joint work of several facilities, of more than one laboratory. And that's really what we need to facilitate in order to bring together the many countries from which European laboratories come and can contribute. So at the moment, well, we have examples in Planet Lab and Géant of the academic and the industrial grade, industrial strength approaches to creating and sustaining a brand. But our concern is when you federate this, how far does it go, and does it stretch to the kind of scale or the scope that we would like to be able to address in the coming decade? I've got some other pictures, so I'll be coming back to that. You can read the set of questions here. Let me continue asking, how do we think about this? I think because I'm trying not to go over the time we've set aside for this discussion, I think it's important that we constantly ask ourselves, what is the larger effort that FIRE can contribute to? And so, for example, the FIPPP has, in its second and now third phase, is asking what kind of range of use cases, experimental facilities, and new technology tests would it like to see coming together. And FIRE, because the facilities are now ready, plays a natural role with this larger set of users. I don't see the educational opportunities on here, but I think the ICT activities could also and should also be viewing FIRE as a natural extender of the capabilities of the programs that they're starting. As I said, we have to be careful to continue to move the process, the calls, the work programs ahead so that it will be possible to shape the outcomes. And we've started thinking about the dimensions in which those outcomes will fall. The one brand at a time, the most reasonable way to look at sustaining a facility beyond a single funding path does pull in the direction of fragmentation or isolating the brands in order to ensure that they stay clear about their purpose and are therefore more able to survive from one funding cycle to the next. The only thing that can pull us towards coherence down at the bottom of the chart, a real portfolio that works together, is making it explicit, as has been done with some success in the later stages of FP7, that it's important that these things work together. The second thing is, do we support a fairly large community activity? And you see in Experimedia and Santander that there's really a range of users that can get something out of these projects or out of the community that forms around these projects. And I think that's very healthy and very exciting. It may not, it's not appropriate for high bandwidth technologies, which have some serious technical problems, interoperability problems to solve. They fit more on the individual side of things. But the widest exposure to the community beyond, the community to which innovation is directed, comes on the right-hand side of this diagram. So we've developed and we'll spell out in the document 4 corners of this chart, which you can see here. The testbed as a service in competition with all of the other ways that these kinds of facilities can be provided is in the upper left-hand corner. As you move to providing more like service guarantees, you see something that is more naturally appropriate to supporting SMEs and testing things that are closer to the marketplace. And in both cases, each user views the stuff he does with these testbeds as kind of his. I think that's where the individual characteristic comes out. We move towards things that are social in their nature, that support groups of people or people interacting with other people. You see things which are highly social, and those in which are tied to a larger platform. This is more people to people, I'd say, in this kind of space, and this is more people to their environment, people to their health, people to underlying data resources that need to be shared. So we're working out scenarios, and we're asking for input to potential scenarios, interesting things that could happen. And we're trying to assure coverage and assure completeness of our thinking about this by filling these 4 corners. Now, you have to ask, in order to take some of these ideas and ask what does it take to make them sustainable, to make them move from EC funding to mixed funding to maybe a life of their own, the classic way of asking questions about the viability, robustness, etc. of a business structure is a canvas chart. This is a canvas chart. And if you look at Smart Santander, it has reasonable things to say in all the boxes of a canvas chart. Smart Santander makes sense. I know I'm out of time, and I'm just about done. If you ask for FIRE as a whole, that's a tougher question, because not all if you take FIRE as a federated organization of everything, put all the brands, each of the brands has problems with some parts of a canvas chart. So getting the whole to be sustainable is a tougher challenge. But let me just say, I think the picture we're arriving at is the future internet is now conceived of by the European public as doing four things that are each really worth doing and very much expected, and we need to try to provide them. Internet of Things, services, information, and supporting and directly responding to people. And an infrastructure that is the foundation of all of that needs to be adaptable and adaptive. So an integrated approach, I believe fire should provide an integrated approach to making some of these things happen, making them demonstrated and getting them out into market. The app store, if you like, in the smart city kind of environment for things that make sense and can be immediately picked up and used. So that's where we go. I was at a conference last week organized by Orange, and so instead of saying thank you at the end of every talk, everybody said merci, which is a nicer way to end.
Okay, thank you very much.